Good afternoon, everybody, and I'm glad to be back with you and doing our Matthew study again this Thursday. And today, on this Thursday, I want to look at Matthew 8, 1 through 17. There are three healings here that I think are kind of interesting as we look at them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on them, but I'd like to look at those three. So if you stop right here and read Matthew 8, 1 through 17, and then start the video back up, and I'll begin discussing it. All right, I'll assume that you've read those, so I'll begin talking about these. So, chapter 8, 1 through 4. This is the very first healing after the teaching discourse. Now, Jesus has been healing prior to this. We don't have any specific healings, but we see in chapter 4, verse 23, I believe, where Jesus is doing a lot of ministry. He's proclaiming the gospel. He is exorcising demons, and he is healing diseases. And so it talks about him healing there. That is not specific episodes. Whereas now in chapter 8 we're getting into some specific episodes. And some of these episodes are really interesting in the type of people that are being given to us as a recorded ministry effort by Jesus. So it's rather interesting. So this episode that we're going to look at is very, very similar to the episode I preached from about 2 weeks ago in Luke chapter 5, 12 through 16. In fact, the way Jesus and the leper correspond to one another, the way they converse, I was looking at it, and I know the words that Jesus speaks are exactly the same in Matthew and Luke. They're exactly the same. And I'm pretty sure most of the words the leper spoke too were exactly the same. You might think, well, that's a no-brainer. They should be. Yeah, they should be, but that's not always the case. In many cases in the Gospels, it's never like that. It's peculiar when you have this kind of agreement. So it's very interesting. Now, in that sermon, I can talk about some of that part of that sermon now that we have this episode in Luke. In that sermon, I talked about enthusiasm that Jesus had in doing the miracle. Let me switch over to my Bible real quick. Okay. So, I know that Jesus had enthusiasm for a couple of reasons. Now, let me just address this fact that the guy is a leper. Okay, so what the person is doing is not appropriate. In fact, it is against the Old Covenant guidelines. You need to go back and read Leviticus chapter 13 and 14. And when you read those chapters, what you find out is that there are guidelines for the leper as far as that person's interaction in community, that person's cleansing of this disease, being declared to having the disease, so forth and so on. It's all entailed within chapters 13 and 14 of Leviticus. And so what the leper is doing is inappropriate. It's wrong. And so he approaches Jesus, and he should have never approached Jesus. He should have stayed away from Jesus. However, here's where the enthusiasm comes in. So what the leper says to Jesus is this. He gives a conditional statement is what he says. So he says, he addresses him as Lord. So he honors Jesus as Lord. And then he says, if you would want to. Or if you would want. If you would want. So there's a question of certainty here. Now, it's not a question of the power that Jesus has, because obviously the leper's coming because he knows that Jesus has the power to do the healing. He wouldn't be there if he didn't. He's wondering if Jesus would choose to, if it would be his choice to. Maybe he's thinking, like everybody else in society pushes me away, I expect Jesus to do the same. However, Jesus stretches out his hand. So he stretches out his hand and touches the leper. So he does that before he addresses him. So he reaches out and touches him, and he says, I want to. And he uses a verb of indication, meaning indicating of a fact. He said, I want to. And then he commands cleansing. He says, basically, be clean. Jesus does. I want to be cleaned. So he doesn't command the disease. You could command the disease to depart the body. You could do that in Greek very easily. In fact, that's kind of the way that Luke does part of his, where some of the differences show up. But you could definitely put that in Greek that way. But this isn't that way. And he's not commanding the leper, he's commanding the body of the leper. for it to be clean. So he says basically, be clean. And then what goes on, he says immediately that the person was healed. Immediately. Now, Jesus, again, Leviticus 13 and 14 are very important here. Jesus tells him he needs to go to the priest and show the priest. This would be the proper guidelines. And so that he would be properly declared clean, because he's clean now. And so he could be involved in synagogue worship and other things. He could go to festivals and be around people again. So he needs to go through those guidelines. And then offer the offering as a testimony to some degree. So now I'm not sure what the gift would. Probably be something very, very small, because the leper wouldn't have much. But to offer something, and then this would be a part of the testimony of his cleansing. But he tells him, tell no one until this is done. Now Jesus is in between covenants. In fact, Jesus is really in the Old Covenant. He is working in the Old Covenant. The New Covenant has not come yet. It is coming. But Jesus is ministering and living under the Old Covenant, so he has to abide by those Old Covenant guidelines. Now, again, the next one. Let's go to the next one. 5 through 13. Jesus has a centurion approach him. A centurion comes forward. So, first, we're in Capernaum. Let me talk about Capernaum just for a moment. This is the area that Jesus is going to do his ministry in for the next, year and a half, basically until he starts moving towards Jerusalem. He starts moving towards Jerusalem after, chapter 16 into chapter 17, 18. He starts moving that way. A lot of time is spent describing the Passion Week, the last week of Jesus. So there are many chapters just concerning that last week of Jesus. So when we get to about chapter 17, Jesus is starting to move towards Jerusalem. But until then, he's working in Capernaum. He'll be doing a Galilean ministry. Capernaum is on the Lake of Galilee. I'm pretty sure it's up on the northwest corner, but he'll be using it basically as his base of operations, and then he'll be involved up there for quite a while. This centurion comes to him. Now, this centurion is a non-Jew. We have to understand that. He is a non-Jew. He's part of the Roman army that is ruling that area at that time. They are under the control of the Roman army, the Roman Empire. So the Roman army is there, and so they are controlling the people, controlling their livelihoods. People didn't like these Roman soldiers. The fact that the soldier comes to him speaks of kindness that's known about Jesus. He wasn't expecting to be repudiated or chastised or screamed and yelled at to leave, get away. No, he expected to be treated well, and Jesus did treat him well. The way Jesus treats people, we all as Christians could learn a lot about the way that he interacts with people. Too many times we probably lose our temper, or we become short with people, or we get frustrated, disgusted, but Jesus wasn't that way. He accepted people. We could learn a lot from the way that he accepted people. Now, at that day, imagine this, Jewish people looking at this Roman soldier talking to Jesus. People are probably wondering, what is going on? Why is Jesus aiding the enemy? That kind of idea. Why isn't Jesus angry at this person, doing this or doing that? Well, that was not the way that Jesus behaved. Again, we could learn a lot from him. But anyway, the centurion talks about his servant. Now, he uses two different words for servant here. He uses one type of word in verse 6, and he uses one type of word in verse 9. Two different Greek words. We translate them both as servant, but the first one has it's a type of servant that a lot of people would consider as maybe like an adolescent, a non-adult. Let's say that. A non-adult, an adolescent, teenager maybe. But the word servant that's used down in verse 9 is not that kind of servant. It's just a general word for servant. So it could be talking about a younger servant. I don't know. It's definitely not a family member, though, but it's someone that this person, the centurion, thought of highly because he comes to Jesus. Now, he is not acting like a Christian. This is not Christian-like behavior. We shouldn't read that into it. This is before the new covenant has come. The centurion more than likely has been to other places to seek other gods for help, and they have not helped out because most people would have believed in an assortment of gods back then. So he probably just comes to Jesus because he's heard. Well, Jesus has been busy, so he's heard something. Maybe back in chapter 4, he heard about Jesus. Maybe he heard about the leper being cleansed. I don't know. But he's heard about Jesus, and he comes to Jesus. And Jesus says that he'll come and heal the person, but then this is where the centurion astonishes Jesus in his understanding of authority. Now again, he talks about faith later, but this is not Christian faith or even Christian-like faith. This person came here because it may have been the only place that he knew to go, or what he'd heard, it compelled him to go. But anyway, he understands his position in relation to Jesus. He calls him Lord, just like the leper did. Same address, which could have meaning for the leper, I think more for the leper probably than this centurion, but regardless. But the next part's what's so interesting. He says, basically, I'm not worthy for you to come into my house. So he recognizes his unworth. He's a Jewish person. A Jewish person did not want to go into a Gentile's place, that kind of idea. He could be recognizing the cultural way that the two races intermixed or related, but I don't think so. I think he understands the position and authority that Jesus has because he talks about his authority. So the centurion, from his military status, his military experience, he understands authority. He says, I can tell a soldier to go do something and that will be taken care of. I don't have to be there in order for it to happen. I can tell someone and they'll go and get it done. He says, I think you have that kind of authority. You can tell me, and by him saying you can basically, tell me and I'll pass it on, or that kind of idea, is that he assumes his subservience to Jesus. Jesus is the one who gives the orders, and he receives it and carries it out. But that's the idea that he has. But then Jesus says no. He's astonished at this person, for one thing, because he says there's no one in Israel, a metaphor for the covenant people, the Jewish people. Excuse me for a second. No one that had such trust in Jesus as this person does, or understanding of his authority. Now, I don't think the centurion understands him as God or anything else. He's heard about what Jesus has done. He's come, and he understands that Jesus can do amazing things. He's seen him do amazing things. If he can do it, close, he can surely do it at a way. He didn't have to touch someone at other times, maybe, and healed, so he could probably do it here. But anyway, Jesus is astonished, and then he talks about the difference in the Jewish people, I guess, in some sense. Now, he talks about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Those were all the forefathers of the Jewish people. Abraham received a covenant promise from God. Jacob received a covenant promise from God. And I believe Isaac did too. It's just Jacob and Abraham's were repeated, whereas Isaac only received it once. I think that's the way it is. But all three of those received this repeated covenant promise from God. So now they didn't live under the old covenant. It was a different promise. The promise was to produce a Messiah, basically. A nation would be produced, and from that nation there would become a Messiah. But he talks about these three being in the kingdom of heaven. Kingdom of heaven is a big topic in the Gospel of Matthew. Jesus is the one who brings the kingdom of heaven. So basically he's telling them that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are in the place that you want to be, but you will not be. They will be cast out, and it's because of their refusal to understand and appreciate who Jesus is. And then he tells the centurion to go, and it will be done. And then we find out that the healing happened very quickly. Now, it doesn't say immediately or at that very moment. In fact, what it says is in that hour, sometime in that hour, which is probably an idiom meaning that it happened very, very quickly. But it's not a momentary thing necessarily. Now, we go on. Verses 14 through 17. Now, Jesus goes back to Peter's house. Now, Peter's married, which is interesting. This tells me that Peter is an older person. Now, he's not terribly old. I think he's probably in his 20s. But generally back then, male adults did not get married until they had their house situation straightened up. And so that's when they would get married. So sometime in their 20s maybe. They married younger women. That women were much younger, but the men were generally in their, we'll say, 20s. Most people didn't live past 45. I think that was the average lifespan. So being in your 20s, that's about half your life. Anyway, he's married. We don't know Peter's wife's name. We don't know Peter's mother-in-law's name, which is interesting because there are other prominent women in the Christian ministry that are spoken of several times in the New Testament. One of them I'm thinking of is Prisca or Priscilla. her name is mentioned many times. And what's so interesting about her is that of them, I think they're mentioned 4 times. I could be wrong. The pair, Priscilla and Aquila. Aquila who is the husband, is only precedes Priscilla once, and it's the first time they're introduced in Acts. After that, Priscilla always precedes Aquila. And so she must have been very, very involved. And I wonder if maybe Peter's wife wasn't involved or Peter's mother-in-law was not involved. Well, we don't know, but they're not named. Now Jesus touches again. Now before he touched the leper, didn't touch the centurion servant, but now he touched this person, and the fever left, and she began to serve. And then he goes into healing and doing some other things also. And notice in verse 16, he says he's doing some of this stuff by a word, by speaking. Now in verse 17, close this up, he talks about being spoken, some validation coming from the prophet Isaiah. This word was spoken from the prophet Isaiah. The problem in verse 17 is the word fulfill. When we see that word fulfill, we automatically think achievement. That is not what is being said in the Greek. Not at all. It is not talking about achievement. In fact, it would be better if it was just translated as fill. This was to fill what was spoken by the prophet Isaiah. That would be much better. You could say fill full, but that's much different than the idea of achieving. It just means you've put more into something. That's the idea I think we really need to understand here. In fact, this is what I always teach about the way the Old Testament is used in the New Testament. There's a type presented in the Old Testament, a type that the people desire or God presents, and then later on Jesus fits into that type, or some ministry of maybe an apostle fits into that type. If you go back and you read Isaiah 53, this is from Isaiah 53 verse 4. He took our illnesses and bore our diseases. That is not what your translations are going to say. Isaiah 53:4 is going to start off and say he bore our griefs or sufferings or something, and sorrows or sufferings. He bore our griefs and sorrows, or he bore our griefs and sufferings. Something to that effect. It's not going to talk about illnesses and disease. However, the Hebrew can mean that. One of the problems I think happens is the way that it's used in 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 25. Isaiah 53 verse 4 is repeated there. Partially. Or Peter is following the Greek version. And it looks like Peter is following the Greek version of the Old Testament. Whereas in the Greek version it slips sins in there, which the Hebrew word generally does not mean sins. Now another thing about Isaiah 53, you got to be careful when you read it. We want to read Jesus into it all the time, but there are many, many aspects of Isaiah. Actually, it's Isaiah 52, verse 13, through chapter 53, verse 12. That is the fourth servant song. There are many aspects of that song that do not fit into the ministry of Jesus, and some of them we have to stretch fairly well to get to fit. The point is that Isaiah never wrote that to forecast about Jesus. In fact, the servant, if you do a word study on servant in Isaiah chapters 40 through 66, and that's where you would need to look. If you do a word study of servant there, and it'd be a word servant in the Hebrew, you'd have to do it in the Hebrew. When you do that, you'll find out that every time that the servant is mentioned in there is identified as Israel. So in Isaiah 53, it never says it because I think it probably assumes that we assume Israel here. Now, there's a lot of theological discussion more on that. Yes, Jesus replaces Israel in Matthew. So you could think about that. Jesus is a replacement, the type idea being presented. But the way he uses it, Matthew uses Isaiah 53 verse 4 here in Matthew chapter 8, is not to talk about salvation ministry. Matthew uses Isaiah 53 verse 4 to validate the healing ministry of Jesus, is what he does. All right, well, that's all I have. So I hope you enjoyed that time that we had, and I look forward to next week, and we'll finish up chapter 8 next week. It shouldn't be too much of a problem. And don't forget, we have our congregational meeting coming up this Sunday, so I hope you can be there, and there's a sign-up sheet for food also if you're interested. So I'll see you on Sunday, and I hope you have a great Friday. Bye.